Hussein?
Thanks. I'd like to begin by thanking the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy for inviting me to be here. It's really wonderful to be with you. Thank you very much. I do think the policy towards Syria is actually moving in an interesting direction, because this afternoon, coalition U.S. aircraft bombed regime forces in support of rebel forces on the ground for the first time. This is a bigger deal strategically than a Tomahawk missile strike, and it was symbolic. This is not symbolic. So I don't know that we have a Syria policy that's coherent, but that's a bigger move away from the Obama approach than the Tomahawk missile strike. I'm just throwing it out there. With regard to the embrace of political authoritarianism, I'm going to begin by talking about it in more specifically, not just the embrace of the authoritarian leaders that you outlined really rather well, I think, but the general move away from placing human rights at the center of American foreign policy, human rights and democracy advocacy. Certainly Trump has pulled out the welcome mat for all kinds of authoritarian figures. Erdogan, you mentioned, certainly. He's even going to welcome Rodrigo Duterte, who's been conducting a campaign of mass murder in the Philippines and boasting about it, and boasting about his own murders. I mean, it's really extraordinary. But he's going to be welcome at the White House. Now, I mean, under Obama, there was this continuity. You're absolutely right. I mean, certainly when Obama welcomed Sisi, when Trump welcomed Sisi, it's not a shift in policy between the United States and Egypt. It's an optics shift. It's meaningful in the sense that diplomacy is meaningful and politics are meaningful. But in terms of practical relationship between Washington and Cairo, it didn't signal a specific change. Although Obama did try to keep such type of leaders at arm's length, deny them photo opportunities, deny them that political benefit and that diplomatic. So there is certainly a shift. The optics matter is what I'm trying to say. And really, that sort of idea of keeping human rights abusers at arm's length, more or less entirely jettisoned by Trump, even though even though Bashir has been invited to the third phase of the Saudi trip, the so-called Arab-Islamic-American Summit. That's what they're calling it. It's a great name. It's basically Trump giving a speech to the members of the Islamic Military Alliance, which Saudi Arabia formed at the end of 2015. And because Sudan is a part of that, Bashir has been invited, but the U.S. Embassy in Khartoum has issued a statement saying he shouldn't come, and I do believe, I would guess that the Saudis would let him know that he's technically invited, but if he has prior commitments, it would be understood, if someone else had to come, or perhaps nobody, that wouldn't be the worst thing. We'll see. Now, I mean, certainly, I think you're right to mention General Sisi as an example of somebody who's been welcomed to the White House, whose approach to counterterrorism and dealing with political dissent and maintaining law and order, in quotes, has involved really indefensible practices, some of which in the long run are counterproductive not only for Egypt, but for the United States. I think that's true. Trump has also decoupled the large weapons sale to, actually fighter jet sale to Bahrain from its own human and civil rights issues. But I do think that the administration's approach to human rights and foreign policy bears a closer look, because I want to argue that there are three distinct approaches, all at work at the same time in this administration, three different profiles on this issue, which are not really compatible. And this is another example of the kind of chaos of this White House, is that there are three senior officials with three different takes on this. First, there's Mr. Trump's attitude, which dispenses with human rights altogether, at least when it comes to pro-American governments. And in general, I mean, Russia, too. He has no problem with Putin and the dead journalists all over the place, and Crimea and Ukraine. That's really not an issue for him. He didn't have a problem with it. He did get upset when he saw dead Syrian children on TV. And you could see that he didn't like that. So he might catch a glimpse of something on television and take it seriously. But other than that, there's no indication that he takes these issues seriously at all. And in fact, I just published a paper today in search of a Trump Middle East policy, which I couldn't find one. I find trends, but I don't find a policy, naturally, I would say. And the most characteristic feature of his emerging non-policy is precisely its radical unpredictability, which is really very self-defeating for a status quo power. If you want to guarantee order and stability and security, and then you're radically unpredictable, you've just defeated your own purpose, magnificently. And it's also its primary characteristic is its unpredictability, because it's a reflection of the man himself and his impulsiveness and lack of any coherency on this. But when he says, there are a few things he's coherent about. I mean, getting closer to traditional allies, making money, selling weapons, those are coherent. Also, when he says we don't want to impose our way of life on anybody, he seems to take that very seriously. So that when it comes to Trump, America first really does mean disinterest in the application of what traditionally, quaintly, were called American values to foreign policy in a manner that's been consistent since the second term of Ronald Reagan. I'm very specific about the second term, and I'll explain why later. The second profile is Secretary of State Tillerson, who has a different approach, at least conceptually. There's no role for human rights in the Trump world. Tillerson has laid out an interesting formulation, especially in his speech at the State Department, which is his only major policy speech so far. He makes a distinction between values, which he says are unchanging and eternal, and policies, which he says are ever-changing. And so this is kind of jarringly Platonic and kind of Hegelian dialect. It's almost like Trotsky in a weird way, but in its kind of dialectic polarity. But you've got this formulation where you've got policy, which is by definition pragmatic and amoral in international relations, trumping, if you'll excuse me, values, which are by definition abstract and relevant at best only to domestic concerns. So rhetorically, this goes beyond Kissingerian realism, but practically, I think, and this is another continuity, it mirrors Barack Obama's anguished or faux anguished distinction between values and interests. That's the way he framed the same conundrum. He didn't say policy, he said interest. And this was most characterized in his speech about the Libya intervention, where he claimed that suddenly, voila, American interests and values finally and for once coincided perfectly. Phew, what a relief. We were all supposed to feel wonderful about that. But what I'm suggesting, apart from the silliness of that, is that even though Tillerson's position seems really offensive and definitely can squander a massive and laboriously accumulated real American asset, which is a certain degree of credibility on human rights, democracy, etc., at least rhetorically, at least in terms of stated values, in the eyes of many potential friends around the world, including potential intelligence assets and others, and people who believe this. In fact, there's very little difference between the Tillerson position and the Obama position. And in practice, you could argue that Tillerson might have been articulating the practical application of great power policy making, what it will be perforce, whatever the ideological or emotional orientation of the practitioner, this is what they're going to end up with. And you could make that case. So certainly if Tillerson and Obama end up in the same place very quickly, that would suggest that pretty much anybody would get there. Anyone who's likely to get into those positions would end up anyway. The third profile in this administration is UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, who has her own foreign policy, and it's entirely separate from Tillerson and Obama. And she has been willing to inject good old-fashioned American umbrage at human rights abuses into her rhetoric, and she's mainly focused on unfriendly regimes so far, especially Venezuela. Her statement on Venezuela was radically different from Tillerson's and wholly incompatible with Trump's. I mean, you just couldn't put the two together. So if Tillerson has this hard-nosed, open quote, realism, close quote, I think an actual realist would be offended by that, but still, and just unreconcilable with Trump's unabashed amorality. So you've got at least, I mean, she wants to, it's this old impulse. Now, that means the administration doesn't speak with a single position. It speaks with three distinctive and different voices. So what does that mean? Well, it means the U.S. is embattled and politically weakened president and an inconsistent administration. So it's very damaging. So what kind of role would the United States play? Well, certainly not the one that Arab reformers and civil society groups would like it to play, as you noticed. It's not necessarily permanent because, as I said, the first Reagan term did not it de-emphasized human rights when it came to allies in the Cold War. And by the time of his second term, he'd come to see that there was a real value in at least rhetorical advocacy about human rights and democracy, even when it came to nominal allies in the Cold War. So these things can change. So the question then is, how does this relate to what's going on in the Arab world? I can't talk about the broader Islamic world. It's too big a topic, but I'll stick to the Arab world. There are two things that are going on, and I have a much more detailed, I'm just going to run through it fairly quickly.
Sure.
I'm not going to read what I've written, but I'll just summarize it. There are two trends that are relevant to this in the contemporary Arab world, big picture trends. One among governments and the other among opposition forces. The trend among governments is, I think, that's interesting and relevant, is the experiment that Saudi Arabia is trying to launch. I wouldn't even say has launched, but I would say is trying to launch. Obviously, the Saudis, like many of the other conservative regimes in the Gulf War, were absolutely horrified by the Arab Spring uprisings. They thought it was disastrous. They feel very vindicated by the outcome, except in Tunisia. Yet they can see that their own status quo and the regional status quo is unsustainable. Economic pressures, youth bulge, lack of employment opportunities, the sclerotic nature of these socioeconomic systems, it's not sustainable. And the Saudis in particular are reacting to a collapse in energy prices and their budgetary problems and the impact that reduced spending has on their social contract. But in general, I would argue that the National Transformation Plan and Vision 2030, which is the 10 and 20-year plans respectively, are an experiment in trying to create managed, orderly, top-down transformation that begins economically, has inevitable social ramifications, and then ultimately a political impact as an alternative model to uncontrolled revolutionary change. So there's an evolutionary experiment under very, very difficult conditions. So if Saudi Arabia could do it, almost any country, I think, could do it. The only real advantage they have is some money, but they really have a huge distance to cover from where they are to anything that would be long-term stable, economically, socially, and politically. All right, so it's very interesting, and I mean, I think that any sensible person can get that while the Arab Spring uprisings did not result in a flowering of much of anything good except in Tunisia, nonetheless, it's sort of similar to the European experience in 1848, a series of failed revolutions that nonetheless implanted the ideas that later on realize themselves. In this case, greater economic justice and social justice, greater accountability, consent of the governed. All these ideas did not go away just because of the outcome of these uprisings. They're very much there. And I think the fact that the Saudis are doing what they're doing is as much a reaction to understanding that as it is to the collapse of oil prices from $100 to $40 a barrel. I mean, really, they're both there. So this is something certainly the United States can help in every way if it had a reasonable policy. The second thing that's going on is among opposition forces and really among Islamist groups, because they are the main opposition forces in the Arab world. And I would argue what's happening, I've explained it much more in detail, but I'm just going to summarize it quickly. What's happening, in my opinion, is that a model that was essentially unchanged for almost 100 years, basically the Muslim Brotherhood approach that really originates and fairly unchanged from the late 20s until a couple of years ago, a few years ago, is essentially dissipating. It's withering and it's disintegrating. This is the right word. It's disintegrating. It's not integral. And it really, the kind of the turning point is the ouster of Mohamed Morsi. And I think what you see then is an acceleration of trends in two different directions. One is a trend towards moderation and modernization and the development of certain groups that come out of this tradition into a post-Islamist phase. Nahda is leading the way, also the Justice and Development Party in Morocco, also parts of the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. Others around the Middle East are becoming parliamentary democracies, post-Islamist groups that are conservative, religious, but fully democratic, constitutional, and normal and healthy parties to represent religious conservatives in a society. It's the most hopeful development in the Arab world in the past probably 25 or 30, maybe more years. It's exceptionally important. But there's another side to this, which is people who don't want to go in that direction and see that the old model is just not functional are drawn to picking up the sword and saying, well, we're not going to go into parliaments, we're going to have jihad. And so there's no surprise that we've seen concomitantly the rise of Daesh and the rejuvenation of Al-Qaeda in these places, war-torn places like Syria and Yemen and whatnot, and that people are drawn from that. And it's not too surprising then that Tunisia would produce both the vanguard party that is leading the way in modernizing and moderating and becoming a really healthy force among the Islamists, and contributing more foreign fighters to Daesh than any other country, even more than Saudi Arabia. Yes, different parts of the country, it's not the same thing, it's not exactly, but it's also not a complete coincidence, is it? I don't think it's a complete coincidence. And what I'm suggesting is that as the old model disintegrates, people are going in one of two directions. Either they're becoming more sensible or they're becoming violently mad. And so there are certainly ways that a coherent, reasonable, engaged, serious American policy that reintegrates an appreciation for what we used to call American values could very much help the first trend, very much help to counter the root causes of the second trend, not bombing people, but actually solving some of the problems that feed groups like Daesh, and can help the Saudis and others that want to do positive change managed to have that actually work over the long run so that they don't have to have an upheaval, which would be preferable, wouldn't it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.